Hi, welcome to this week's With Liberty and Justice for Some. I'm Congressman Mark Pocan. With me today for our one question is Mac Haddo, who is the Senior Fellow on Public Policy at the American Kratom Association. Mac, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Congressman Pocan. It's a delight, and thank you for your leadership in this issue.
Well, of course. No, thank you. So my question for you is, if you had the ability, and I know your political background, so you probably have some ideas, to change any one federal law, you wouldn't have to go through Congress. It would just kind of happen. You wouldn't have to worry about going through a committee process. What would that one law be, and why would you make it the change that you do?
So I would make a change to the federal laws governing the access of consumers to safe botanical products. Currently, federal law doesn't give a clear pathway for kratom, for example, to be approved by the FDA and to be properly regulated at the federal level. We're doing it at the state level incrementally. We have 18 states that have passed the regulatory framework. We need to do that at the federal level. And that is probably the biggest change. Now there are other priorities in my broader life that I could probably say a lot of things as you would need to be changed in the federal law, but this is one that impacts the quality of life and benefits millions of Americans. And it's just going to take a slight tweak in the federal law in order to ensure that consumers have access to this wonderful plant product that would be available to them.
Great. I appreciate it, Mac, and thanks for all the work that you do with the American Kratom Association.
Thanks, my friend. Appreciate it.
Yep. With the big ugly law passing Congress, we now spend $1 trillion this year on the Pentagon. That's trillion with a T, like in Trump. A number so big, it's hard to imagine. Think about 1,000 billions or a million millions. 1 trillion seconds is approximately 31,710 years. If you laid end to end $1 trillion bills, you would stretch almost 97 million miles, which is farther than the distance from the Earth to the sun. So that's a lot of money. And the lion's share doesn't go to pay for pay and benefits for our troops and their families, but instead it goes to defense contractors. And that money is often spent with little regard for the largeness of the amount. In fact, the Pentagon has failed 7 consecutive audits. No other federal agency would be allowed anything close to that. And they just keep getting more and more money every year. So why is it so hard to get a handle on this now $1 trillion amount? Well, that's what groups like POGO are around for. The Project on Government Oversight, POGO, was founded as a Pentagon watchdog, but now it has expanded its focus to the entire federal government, fighting for a more effective, accountable democracy. They've been around for 40 years and are effective at getting out the message of waste in government. Their Director of Government Affairs, Dylan Hedtler-Gaudette, has been the organization since 2018. He works on Pentagon spending as well as other issues of effective and ethical government. And he's been selected by The Hill as one of the top lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And we are very lucky to have him with us today. So welcome, Dylan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Congressman. It's a pleasure to be here. The only thing I'm a little bit apprehensive about is being called a lobbyist, but that is what I do. I understand it, but I like to think of myself more of an advocate than a lobbyist. But
I like that.
Here nor there.
I like that term too, especially for you and for your organization. So we'll use advocate. So tell us a little more about POGO, because I got to admit, it immediately brings a toy stick to my mind from my youth. And tell us about what work you guys are doing.
Sure. So quickly, just as a little anecdote, we used to lean into that association with the toy that you mentioned. We had a big actual POGO stick in our lobby when we used to have a kind of a brick and mortar office down in DC. We used to have a POGO stick right there, and when you walked in, so you're not the only one in that association. Yeah.
Good.
But in all seriousness, I appreciate your intro. We have been around for about 40 years, since 1981. Actually, a little more than 40 years, close to 45. 1981 was when we got started. Some of your listeners may be familiar with those old stories about the Pentagon spending $436 on hammers and over $7,000 on coffee pots. It was actually us who got started by bringing to light those expenditures and really shining a bright spotlight on how the Pentagon was wasting taxpayer dollars before it was as commonly known. So that's really where we got our start. That's where we made our bread and butter over the initial sort of few years of our being around as an organization. And we actually, as you noted in your intro, we grew to expand beyond just the Pentagon in terms of trying to bring more accountability, transparency, and effectiveness to the federal government. But the Pentagon, I don't need to tell you this, Congressman, but the Pentagon continues to be the motherlode of waste, fraud, abuse, corruption, cronyism. So we continue to spend a lot of time looking at that particular issue set, but we also take a long, hard look at areas like the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, who are particularly relevant these days. But that's what we do. We like to think of ourselves as the people's watchdog. And so really glad to be here today to talk to you about all things Department of Defense.
Yeah, and some other issues I think we're going to get into, because you guys do extra work. I appreciate that. But let's just start with the Pentagon, since that was part of your original focus as an organization. Why do so few members of Congress seem to care about what we spend on the Pentagon?
It's a really good question, and actually, one, Congressman, I think you may be in a better position to answer than me. But I'll give you my outsider's look at that, kind of from the outside looking in. You actually touched on this a little bit as you were kind of introducing the episode earlier when you talked about defense contractors. And what defense contractors are, in other terms, is a giant industry lobbying group in some ways. And so they exercise a tremendous amount of influence over what Congress does and over what the Department of Defense does when it comes to acquisition, procurement, contracting. And what they also do very smartly is they strategically locate their operations and their facilities and their manufacturing plants all over the country in various congressional districts and states, so that they can go into virtually any member of Congress's office and say, hey, you better give us what you want, or something might happen as far as jobs in your state or in your district. So they're very smart about how they do that. And as such, there are about a handful of defense contractors, big, giant corporations, we call them the primes, who end up receiving hundreds of billions of dollars every year in taxpayer-funded defense contracts.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. That's been my observation. It's almost like it's considered a jobs program rather than a national defense program. And for that reason, because of the presence in everyone's district, Barbara Lee and I originally formed a defense spending reduction caucus. Now I chair that with Ilhan Omar. But I think what you said is exactly my take as well. We spend more than the next 9 countries combined on their defense budgets. That just seems incredibly out of whack. How do you guys look at that amount of money and what we're actually getting for it?
Yeah, so, in the corporate world, you hear about ROI a lot, which stands for return on investment. And if we think about defense dollars in ROI terms, it's a very, very bad return on investment. And there are some, classic case study kind of poster child examples of that, the F-35 being an prime example of that. But in more general terms, we spend more and more money every year, and more we hear about programs that aren't working. They're behind schedule, they're over budget, they're not delivering the sort of promised capabilities to the end users, which is to say people on the ground who are employed by the United States military, active duty people enlisted. They're not getting what they need. Their families are being shortchanged in terms of things like housing and healthcare. And yet, defense contractors are able to continue to line their pockets to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. So that spending is way out of whack. We don't need to spend as much as we do. And even if we were spending this much, it would be somewhat excusable, not fully excusable, but it would make more sense if we were getting the things we were promised and if we were getting bang for our buck, but we're not getting any of that. So we're sort of in a worst of all worlds scenario when it comes to defense spending.
And just that size and scope, more than the next 9 countries combined. Again, I just have such a hard time when you explain that to people. They just can't understand why we need to spend at that level.
Yeah, it is pretty preposterous. I would also note that, again, this is something I don't need to tell you, Congressman. You're in the halls of Congress. You see this every day. But we're constantly being told, we're fear-mongered, essentially, about the threat of China, particularly China in the context of, basically a military arms race. And so oftentimes that's what you will hear people in the defense industry doing, or people in Congress who are particularly cozy with the defense industry. They'll just, a noun, a verb, and China, and that's basically all you need to justify spending however much money you want to spend on program X, Y, or Z. So there is a bit of a sort of a leveraging or an exploitation of that sort of comparison of how much we spend versus how much they spend, whether that's China or anyone else, and that's constantly used as a way to justify ever increasing spending. We even hear from defense hawks that we must spend 3 to 5% more every year, no matter what's happening on the ground, no matter what we're doing, no matter if we're in a war or not. We still must spend 3 to 5% more on defense every year. It's absolutely insane, Congressman. Again, don't need to tell you this, but it is insane.
Yeah. Well, and then on top of it, when you start talking about the waste, fraud, and abuse, I mean, the Pentagon has failed 7 consecutive audits. I can't think of any other federal agency that has done anything close to that and still allowed to operate. Can you talk about what that means to fail 7 consecutive audits?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a massive red flag. Passing an audit is not the end state. That's a bare minimum requirement that any organization, any entity worth its salt should be able to do, is pass an audit. But that's not where we end. That's where we begin the process. And if the DoD can't even pass an audit, you know how bad the rest of the situation is as far as how it manages money, how it conducts oversight of that money, those kinds of mechanisms that are supposed to be in place. If you can't even pass a financial audit, we should have very little trust and faith in the fact that they're doing the rest of the things they need to be doing to be responsible stewards of these hard-earned, precious public dollars.
Well, and even in that last audit, they could only account for 56% of their $4.1 trillion in assets, which is pathetic, but it's an improvement over the 37% in fiscal year 23. I mean, how is it that we really don't know what they have in assets? I can't even comprehend that.
Yeah, that's a really it's complex, but it's also not in some ways. So there are just warehouses and warehouses and warehouses that are sort of that are located and dispersed all throughout the country that have the Department of Defense assets in them. Sometimes they're as simple as spare parts, but they're just all over the place. And it's just, DoD does not have a good, modern, up-to-date system of keeping track of all of that stuff. And it does get complicated. To be fair to the Department of Defense, it is the largest and most complicated, defense department in the federal government. As far as an agency goes, it's big, it's bureaucratic, it's labyrinthine, it's Byzantine. It is hard to keep track of all of that stuff. But something being hard is not an excuse for not doing it, especially when we're talking about trillions of dollars every year in taxpayer dollars. And if you average that up, we love to do 10-year budget windows in Congress, right? 10-year budget windows in Washington. So that $10 trillion that you're talking about for the Department of Defense, so they need to step their game up and get better at tracking that stuff. To its credit, the Marines did pass their audit last year, and they're very proud of that fact, as they should be.
Yeah. I just wish they all could. But so where does that $1 trillion go? Because you referenced it early on. This isn't supporting the troops and their families. It's not going to the housing and other issues they have. But as I understand it, just a huge chunk, maybe even over half of it, goes to defense contractors. Can you talk about how that money is spent?
Yeah. So you're right. Roughly about half of the defense budget every year is awarded out in the form of straight up contracts, and that does go to defense contractors. Usually, or the overwhelming preponderance of that goes to the top 5 defense primes. We know who they are. I won't name them specifically because they get litigious sometimes, but you know who they are. And unfortunately, it goes to a wide range of things. It could be, technology contracts. And we're starting to see the emergence of a new sort of generation of prime defense contractors who are trying to position themselves as, 2025's version of the old primes. And they're starting to get a bunch of these contracts too. But, it goes to everything from jet fighters like the F-35 we mentioned earlier to large Navy ships. It goes to everything you could think of, from small handguns to massive aircraft carriers, and it pays for all of these things, but it pays for them in timelines. And so we might buy something, or quote unquote buy it this year, but it might take us 5, 10, 15 years to actually see that thing being used by troops on the ground, right? So part of the problem here is that these timelines and these time horizons are so long that that's where a lot of the black hole ends up happening and where all the money just gets thrown into the black hole, because they're all on these different complicated production timelines, and then contractors have an incentive to draw out those timelines because they get paid the longer they have to be producing the thing, the more they get paid.
Gotcha. Kind of like change orders with construction, right? That's where they make some of their money. And in this case, if they can extend that. Okay. I hadn't heard that before. I appreciate that.
And repair and maintenance is a huge cost driver of any big defense program. You know, it costs a lot of money to operate, maintain, and repair those things. And so what contractors have been doing all the way up until this year, maybe if something actually good happens in the NDAA, they've been able to retain to themselves the right to repair all of these things all the way through the entire life cycle. So it ends up being basically a forever contract. It's like a money spigot they can turn on and keep on for the entire duration of the program, because they're able to do all of the maintenance and the repair as well as the initial production and the R&D. So we've been trying to change that bit, that right to repair bit a little bit here in this recent NDAA. So we're cautiously hopeful about that, but that still remains to be seen.
Sounds like you and I should form a Gaudette Pocan and see if we could become a contractor, because certainly it's so. One of the things you were referencing earlier was you guys are the ones who exposed this overpriced hammers and coffee makers. And, that's one of the things that I think people do. It did sink into the psyche that we spend sometimes astronomical amounts compared to very similar items that are commercially available. What are some of those worst examples, and why is it that those are realities?
Yeah, so one glaring example that just got exposed earlier this year was a soap dispenser that's supposed to go in a plane, just like in a bathroom, that cost $6,000 a piece for some inexplicable reason. A soap dispenser that we were able to, compare with a very similar product on Amazon, by the way. So you didn't have to go very far or look very hard to find it. And for some reason, the United States military was paying $6,000 a pop for a soap dispenser.
Did it do anything different, Dylan?
No, it basically just dispensed soap. That's what it did. And so this is one of those classic examples, and I'm glad you brought up. These small items, they're often referred to as spare parts. This is often where a lot of the real egregious kind of price gouging and price hiking and the real corruption happens. And part of why it happens is because the way the Defense Department tries to get those things is often run through what's called a commercial item acquisition process. And so, as the name implies there, the idea there is that you're just buying stuff that you're able to buy out there in the regular market. But you might be able to go to Lowe's or Walmart or something like that and just buy these products, right? And so they try to make it a more sped up, a more streamlined process, because hey, if it's a commercial item and it's available on the market, we probably don't need to go through all these complicated oversight processes. We can probably just go buy a bunch of these things, right? But what contractors do is they try to get things categorized as commercial items, and then if they are categorized as commercial items, they have all of the leveraging and negotiating power. They don't have to provide the Defense Department with price and cost information, or that the Defense Department can make sure it's getting a good deal. They just have to take whatever price the contractor gives them, which is how you end up with a $6,000 soap dispenser or a $436 hammer. So we've been pounding the table for years to try to close the loopholes in the commercial item acquisition ecosystem, because it's way too easy to game that system. And $1 million here, 10 million there, you start adding up to a lot of dollars being wasted each year.
Yeah. What are some other the gouging examples that you've seen? It may not just be on small items, but just gouging in general by contractors.
So there was an example a few years back of a smaller contractor called TransDime that was actually able to exploit these very same loopholes, like to be upcharging for things as basic as individual nuts and bolts and things like that. They were able to be upcharging things by sometimes upwards of 3,000%.
Wow.
So they charge one price one year and then they'd increase the price 3,000% the next year for no apparent reason. But again, because they weren't required to provide any justification or data behind their pricing, the Department of Defense just bought those things because they sort of had to. And so that's another example. There are plenty of them, and we try to document as many of them as we can, and we're continuously on the lookout for people who want to kind of partner with us to expose those kinds of things.
No, thanks for doing that, because We need that much more. You mentioned that the money doesn't go to troops or for housing and benefits. I mean, do you feel that from what you hear as you're doing all this work in the Pentagon area that we're adequately taking care of the troops while at the same time we're more than adequately taking care of the contractors?
But the short answer is no, not at all. We are not adequately taking care of the troops. And I would say in particular, and my organization has done a lot of work in trying to investigate and expose one specific area of this problem, and that's when it comes to privatized housing that is supposed to be for service members and their families, right? So you think of the barracks, that's where individual service members live, and they cram a lot of them into them, kind of like a dormitory style housing, but they have a different kind of housing for service members who have families. So they've got spouses, they've got children, and what the Defense Department did in the late 90s is they privatized the family housing operation. They used to run family housing themselves, but then they decided to privatize it. What we've seen is that has turned into a real sort of hotbed of corruption and abuse and exploitation, where the families of service members are not able to get basic accommodations and basic repairs done, and things like black mold and pest infestations are running rampant in this family housing. But because of the sort of the contractual arrangement between these private housing companies and the bases that the housing is on, each individual service member and their family, they have no way of trying to seek redress for these kinds of things the way you and I can. We can just reach out to our landlords if we are renting or whatever. We have ways to address these things. But if you're a service member and your family, you don't, because the rent automatically gets taken out of your paycheck every month, and so you don't have the option of withholding rent. And so these private housing companies, they just say, oh, we're not going to deal with that. Mold is infesting a house, and they say, well, there's no mold standard at the federal level that you can hold us accountable to, so that's just too bad for you. It's really bad. It's really bad. And that's the kind of thing we should be spending money on, is improving conditions for service members and their families, not lining the pockets of large, extremely profitable companies.
Yeah, we're basically propping up slumlords. It sounds like with that.
Yeah. Yes.
I know POGO used to have, I don't know if you still do, a Pentagon revolving door database. I know you did a lot of work in that. Does that still exist? And what was that about?
Yes. But we actually don't run that database anymore, unfortunately. It just became too resource intensive after a while. But the basic premise there was we tried to keep track and make available to the public information about people who used to work at the Defense Department who would then go to work for private industry, specifically the defense industry. And obviously the revolving door would spin the other way too. People from industry would go into the Defense Department. And so we would try to keep track of the individuals doing that, and we happen to know that actually at DOD internally, it's a non-public thing, but they have their own database that tracks this stuff too, because it's important. Like as a matter of law, they're supposed to be keeping track of who's working where, because there are conflict of interest rules on the books, so they do this themselves. They just don't make it public. So we basically tried to provide that as a kind of a resource. And it was, it was shocking to see how much of a sort of a connection and a relationship there is between private industry and the Defense Department. And if you start to unpack that a little bit, you start to see why we get the outcomes that we get as far as contracting and as far as preferential treatment, is because there's just a lot of people who are eyeing the door, leaving the Defense Department at some point, and the most logical place and the most lucrative place for them to go would be to the very same industry that they were supposed to be regulating or dealing with or overseeing in some way. And it's just, it's noxious, and it's a real kind of corrupting influence on the whole process.
And what's the scope of that? I mean, how expansive is this?
It's really common. It is really common for high-ranking, high-level DOD officials, sometimes even high-ranking and listed people, generals and that kind of thing, to once they leave the government to go straight to industry. It is extremely common, and industry loves it too, and so they will often issue these glowing press releases, which is part of how we used to be able to keep track of this, about the fact that they just acquired, this 4-star general, or this contracting officer, this DOD acquisition professional, and they're very public about it, and they're very blatant about it, and it makes sense why they would want those individuals on their payroll. But it's not a good thing as far as public resources being responsibly handled. It's not a good thing as far as corruption being handled or being mitigated. It's actually pernicious, and it really exacerbates all of those problems.
Well, thank you for watching this largely unwatched portion of the federal budget. I mean, it really matters that you guys are doing the work. You mentioned up front, though, that you also are doing this with Justice and with Homeland Security. Is there anything you'd like to say about either of those agencies to share?
Yeah. So, the reconciliation bill, and this also relates to, I think you mentioned it at the outset, but the reconciliation bill that Congress passed earlier this year, it definitely infused a bunch of money into the Department of Defense, but it also turbocharged the budget of the Department of Homeland Security, and specifically ICE within that budget. And we've seen in recent months the way that those additional resources are being used to menace the streets of the United States of America. It's extremely troubling and extremely concerning. And there's kind of a nexus between what they're doing at DHS and what's happening as far as domestically deploying either active duty troops or National Guard troops. And so we are extremely concerned about the way, a department like the Department of Justice, like the Department of Homeland Security, and increasingly like the Department of Defense are being weaponized and being turned inward, to intimidate and to harass the kind of American people. So
yeah,
that's the kind of connective tissue that we're looking at, and we're trying to find ways to sort of expose as much of that as possible and to work with people like you who really care about those issues and agree that those issues are corrupting and problematic from all kinds of angles, and trying to see what we can do about it. I mean, obviously, this is an administration that doesn't seem to care all that much about what Congress has to say about these things, but we hope that, there are things that we can do here and there to try to fight back against what's happening.
Well, and just working public opinion. I did 4 town halls yesterday in my neighboring Republican member of Congress's district, Derek Van Orden, because he's never done a open public town hall in 3 years. So I decided, people of the 3rd district deserve to be heard. So I did 4 cities in his district, and every single town hall, in addition to the most extensive conversation was about healthcare, but people brought up watching what ICE is doing. And I think there are ways to channel that public opinion. People are very concerned about what's being done in our country's name to people. And, the work you're doing can really tie to that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing what you're doing too, Congressman. I mean, obviously being in the minority, there are only so many levers that you have to pull, but that sounds like a very good one there as far as, reaching out to the public, be it in your district or elsewhere, and trying to spread the good word and trying to show people that there's something they can do in raising their voices. We're trying to do the same thing, but just from a different entry point. We don't have as much reach as a member of Congress does, but, we do what we can here and really appreciate the leadership you're showing.
Oh, thank you. Let's talk about a few other areas your organization's paying attention to. One, there's been a lot of talk about members of Congress who buy and sell individual stocks. I support a ban on that because I know that I get inside information. I mean, it's honestly part of my job to help a company in my district as they're navigating the federal government. But that means sometimes I'm getting insider information that I feel would be unethical to act on. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of bad stories out there by people moving stocks that seem to be done perhaps with inside information or at certain timing that the rest of the public wouldn't have. Can you talk about what work you're doing on this and why we need to put a ban on buying stocks by members of Congress?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Congressman, for putting your name on some of those bills. I've seen you listed as a co-sponsor there, and really appreciate that. Putting your money where your mouth is, literally on that is really important, and you're doing that, so that's great. But top line here is that the fact that members of Congress are allowed to trade stocks is extremely ethically, and I think institutionally, as far as Congress as an institution, it's just gross and unacceptable. As you point out, members of Congress are privy to a bunch of non-public information that the rest of us aren't. It's not that we think that everybody in Congress is insider trading. We don't. That's not the case. But the option is there, the temptation is there, and there's too much of a sort of a pall that is cast over what Congress does. The appearance of impropriety is often just as corrosive as the actual thing. So, the smart way to go about this, and the only really effective way to go about this, is to just have a ban on members of Congress and their immediate families from trading stock. That way everyone who comes into Congress is sort of aware of what the kind of rules are, the obligations are, and there are already some rules and obligations, as you know, Congressman. You already have to do a bunch of stuff when you become a member of Congress that you wouldn't have to do if you were just a random kind of American citizen, right? Like you have to
Yeah.
file financial disclosure, you have to comply with certain house rules, you have to do certain things about reporting when you're traveling here or talking with, right? All kinds of stuff you have to do already. So there's an understanding of a compact between constituents and their elected representatives, and there's some sacrifice on the part of elected representatives. And in our view, a basic sort of obligation, responsibility should be to like put themselves above reproach by not being able to trade stocks and being okay with that, because being a member of Congress is an extraordinary privilege, and there isn't anyone who's required to be a member of Congress. That's not a compulsory thing. You don't get drafted into it. You make a choice to run for Congress, and I think a part of that choice ought to be that you can't trade stocks.
Well, just the practical, like I said, there's companies that maybe do a medical device, for example, and they're if they get approved by Medicare to cover it, they're going to have a huge increase in sales. But we're also helping them navigate those sometimes Byzantine federal agencies. So that is the kind of information that we get. But how wrong would it be for me to somehow then use that to my personal advantage as opposed to my responsibilities as a member of Congress to help them navigate the federal government?
That's right. And this actually ties back a little bit to something we were talking about earlier when you asked like why, like trying to figure out why members of Congress continue to allow the sort of Defense Department to be off the rails in the way that it is. And, if you look at the data around which members of Congress own stocks, for example, in some of those big defense contractors, and which members of Congress are receiving large campaign contributions from the defense industry, you see a huge overlap between those members and being on the authorizing committee, the armed, House Armed Services, Senate Armed Services, or being on the appropriating committee, House Defense. So that's a part of the puzzle too. Like it just ends up, creating a very bad look at the very least, and in some cases it may be kind of, it may create a bad structure of incentives for people to do things, to take votes, to introduce legislation, like to do things they wouldn't otherwise do if their own financial well-being is tied to the well-being of a particular industry.
Right. No, and that's why I think when I first got to Congress, I think there were only about 3 people that didn't take corporate PAC money. Now we're up to 65 of us, myself included. And that is another positive sign to our constituents, at least I think, that, we're not letting that drive decisions.
Absolutely.
So how about members of the Supreme Court? Are they living to high enough ethical standards?
Not even close.
Question, isn't it?
Yeah. I would say among the 3 branches, somehow the federal judiciary, and then of course Supreme Court being at the apex of that branch, they have the lowest ethical standards in terms of things on the book that they have to comply with. And what we continuously hear from them, especially from Supreme Court justices, is, well, our own judgment is going to be the best way to go about this. And I get that they are Supreme Court justices and there are only 9 of them, but they're still human beings. They've still got their own biases and their own preferences and their own individual, they've got the experiences they bring to the table, their ideological, they have all that stuff. Having a black robe on does not make you immune from the human condition or from human tendencies. And so it is absolutely ludicrous how few ethical rules that they have in place, and few, especially ones that can be in any way sort of adjudicated by anyone else. The Supreme Court is kind of above the rest of the judiciary, and they can't be held accountable in any meaningful way. And so it is pretty laughable, the kind of ethical situation we find ourselves in. They don't have any restrictions in terms of what they can own stock in. I mean, they're supposed to recuse themselves if there's a conflict of interest, but again, there isn't anyone there, like a cop on the beat, to hold them accountable to those rules, to enforce those rules. It's just a really bad situation from an ethical standpoint, and it's something that the Supreme Court really ought to get with the times and support some of the legislation that is out there to kind of apply some of the same rules. At the very least, they should be subject to the same rules as everyone else in the federal government. Now, obviously, I think, as we were just talking about, those rules ought to be stronger than they currently are. But as a minimum, they ought to have to comply with the same rules.
Yeah. No, and thank you also for your work on that. One more relatively obscure topic, but honestly, it's getting more attention recently, given the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Your organization follows foreign influence and the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA. Some have suggested that groups like AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, should have to register under FARA due to their robust advocacy for Benjamin Netanyahu's government. Based on the work that you've done around FARA, what do you think about that? And more generally, do we need tighter standards for how we interact with agents of other countries?
Yeah, I'll take that in reverse order. We definitely need tighter standards as far as like the actual, the framework around kind of regulating and scrutinizing and overseeing who's representing entities, especially overseas entities, be they foreign companies or foreign countries. We need a much more robust sort of like structure of regulations around that. The Foreign Agent Registration Act is good in theory, but it hasn't been meaningfully updated for close to 30 years now. So it's long overdue to be updated to reflect kind of modern times. Absolutely, there needs to be tighter scrutiny. And there is currently, obviously rules and regulations around lobbying in general are pretty lax. And so there are actually a bit tighter rules when it comes to FARA, if you compare that to what's under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, the LDA. So the LDA should be tightened as well, because any lobbying can be problematic, but it's definitely I think it deserves a higher level of scrutiny when you're talking about that kind of foreign lobbying on behalf of foreign interests, because at the end of the day, policymakers here should be ideally and primarily thinking about the well-being of the American people. Right. And that doesn't mean it's not going to implicate the rest of the world. Of course, we are the most powerful country in the world. That isn't to say the rest of the world isn't going to be impacted in some way by U.S. policy, and that should always be a consideration as well. But the topmost consideration, especially for elected officials, again, I don't need to tell you this, Congressman. I'm preaching to the choir, I know, but there are people who, the people in Wisconsin who you are there to represent, they have to be the primary concern, right? And that's true for every elected official. And so that's why we care more about cracking down on that kind of lobbying, foreign lobbying, as opposed to domestic.
Sure. And do you have any thoughts? And if you don't, that's fine. But on this situation with having, watching the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I have seen a lot of social media traffic with people suggesting that perhaps, groups like AIPAC should have to register under FARA given the type of advocacy they do. Is that anything you guys look at, or?
So I haven't been tracking specifically what AIPAC has been doing.
Sure.
What I would say, be it AIPAC or any other organization, if they are lobbying on behalf of a foreign entity, be it a foreign government or foreign company, they are supposed to register under FARA. Period. It doesn't matter what country they're lobbying for. I'd say if they're engaged in activity that meets the definition of lobbying, they absolutely ought to be registering under FARA. Gotcha. I'm not sure about AIPAC in particular, just because I haven't been tracking what AIPAC's been doing kind of on a day-to-day basis, but I don't see any reason why they should be excluded from FARA if they're doing that kind of work and that kind of activity.
Yeah, and as you said, 30 years we haven't updated it. Perhaps that's the place to begin with all of this. Anything else that you're working on that you're particularly proud of you'd like to share?
Oh, well, that's a question. Well, we're always, continuing to talk about sort of evergreen things that have been in need of reform for a long time. So things like protecting whistleblowers, for example, from retaliation. That's something that we're really bullish on. And in particular areas, for example, like anyone in the military or anyone in the intelligence community, they have even fewer protections in terms of trying to blow the whistle, even as compared to the rest of the federal government. So we're really keen on and trying to do some work around enhancing whistleblower protections for people all across the government, but especially in the sort of national security space. Inspector General continue to be a big area of interest for us. We're huge champions of Inspector General, have been for as long as POGO has existed. We've been championing Inspector General, and obviously what's been happening to individual IGs, but also the whole like concept of having an internal sort of oversight and watchdog structure of IG. It's really been sad to see what's happening in the last 9 months. They've just been undercut. They've been unceremoniously and illegally fired, by the way. So that's been really troubling for us, and we're doing everything we can to push back on that kind of thing. But that's largely a matter of what the people on the Senate side do around confirmations and nominations of Inspector General and kind of holding the administration to account there. But we are deeply troubled by what's been happening to the Inspector General, that whole ecosystem of oversight within the executive branch. So the list goes on, Congressman.
Yeah.
I know we've only got so much time here, and there's an infinite number of issues that are kind of, I think, important to think about and to work on. But I'll probably leave it there, unless you've got any other specific items you're interested in.
No, I'll tell you that's, I just wanted to profile. You guys do really great work, and we appreciate all you do. And, being able to highlight, because I think everyone's heard of that overpriced hammer or coffee maker. And, the fact that you guys are the ones behind that and all the other work you do, we just wanted to share that with the public. How do people follow you or POGO via social media? Do you have anything you can share?
Yeah, yes. Well, POGO is on all the usual channels as far as social media goes. Twitter /X. I will never get used to calling it X, but
I know.
Twitter /X. Blue Sky, Instagram. We're on all those, so you can find a POGO there. Project on Government Oversight. Our website's a great place to go to read any of our reports and fact sheets and analyses. We're always putting stuff out, hopefully, to kind of educate and help people understand what's going on, because it can get very wonky and complicated and confusing. So we try to bring a little bit of clarity and sunlight to some of that stuff. And I've got a bunch of great colleagues at POGO who do really good writing on these issues. So I'd encourage you to come to the website, and it's pretty easy to remember. It's just pogo.org, pogo.org. I'd say that's about it.
No, thank you so much, Dylan. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us today.